We are in chapter 19. Kind of left you with a little bit of a cliffhanger last week. So Muriel ended up, she didn't give Josh away, right? So she left. And while Josh was waiting to see if she would send help, um, he was trying to stall. So who helped him? Willie. Yay, Willie. So Willie was helping him stall. And then even Florence kind of helped by screaming really loudly, right? So they were all stalling, and then Mr. Turlip tried to um, kill Florence, right? He tried to shoot him and shoot her, and Josh saved Florence. But the bad thing is he got away with the money. So now we ended with Mr. Turlip running away and Josh locking the door and alone in the house, but he didn't save the money. Let's see what happens. Chapter 19. A shrill sound sliced through the black night, but this time it wasn't the peacock. Sirens rose and fell close by. I rushed to the window and saw the red taillights still in the driveway. The thief's car stood nose to nose with a police car. Blue lights whirled, sending flashes of color across the trees. The police car had entered Aunt Ethel's driveway before the thief could drive out. A second police car pulled in directly behind the first one. The sirens died. Two people in uniform got out of each car and approached the thief's car with their guns drawn. I ran out to the porch. "He's armed," I shouted. "He has a gun." The police officers surrounded the car. One of them opened the driver's door. The man stepped out with his empty hands over his head. He was not wearing the ski mask. As I cautiously approached the cars, I heard one of the officers say, "Aaron Turlip? What are you doing here?" I might ask you the same," the man said. "I came to visit Ethel Hodge, but she isn't home." Is he going to get away with it? The officer turned to one of the other officers. "This is Aaron Turlip," he said, "manager of the Hillside Bank." "May I put my hands down now?" the thief asked. "Clearly, you've made a mistake here and are looking for someone else, so I'll be on my way." "No!" I shouted as I ran toward them. "There's no mistake. This man held a gun on me and threatened to kill me." "Why?" an officer asked. "I was planting flowers at the cemetery when I found a buried box of money. He came and made me give it to him. I think it was stolen." The police kept their guns drawn. One of them patted down the thief while the others searched his car. One of the officers called out from the front seat of the car, "The kid's right. There's a box full of $100 bills. There's also a handgun and a black ski mask under the seat. Can you explain those?" the officer who had recognized Mr. Turlip asked. Mr. Turlip said, "I demand to call my attorney." Mrs. Morris drove in behind the police cars. She ran to me, her red hat askew, and hugged me. "Are you all right?" she asked. I struggled to get out of her ample grasp. "I'm fine," I said. "Thanks to you." She and I went back to her car, where we could see what happened without being in the way. Soon a police officer questioned both of us, then set a time for us to come to the police station the next morning. Mrs. Morris had to drive her car up to the house when a police tow truck came to take Mr. Turlip's car away. As we watched from the porch, I told Mrs. Morris that Aunt Ethel had a broken ankle and was in the hospital. Mrs. Morris wanted me to come home with her, but I said I had animals to care for, which was true. "Then I'm spending the night here," she said. "I can sleep in Florence's room." "You don't have to do that. With Mr. Turlip in custody, I'm not scared to stay by myself." "I know you aren't, but I wouldn't sleep a wink knowing you're out here by yourself." Since Aunt Ethel's telephone wasn't working, she gave one of the police officers her daughter's phone number and asked him to let her family know where she was. As soon as the tow truck left, the two squad cars left also, with Mr. Turlip in the back seat of the first one. I fed Florence, who seemed no worse for his encounter with Willie, and took a shower. Then Mrs. Morris and I finished off the chocolate chip cookies. Although I really wasn't scared, I did lock the doors before Mrs. Morris and I went upstairs. Bed had never felt better, but I was too keyed up to fall asleep right away. I lay thinking about everything that had happened. I wished Willie would show up so I could thank him for helping me. If he had not come and distracted Mr. Turlip by pushing the phone to the floor and breaking a plate and making Florence screech, I wouldn't have been able to keep Mr. Turlip there long enough. He would have gotten away with the money before the police arrived. I wondered why Willie had come when I called. I've already moved his leg bones, so he didn't have anything to gain by helping me. Was he keeping his end of the bargain? He had said he didn't ever go places he had not been when he was alive. Yet, he came when I needed help. He had used up all his strength trying to scare Mr. Turlip. I wondered how Aunt Ethel was. I hoped she'd come home tomorrow. I had expected the summer here to be dull, but Aunt Ethel made it interesting. I'd eaten spaghetti for breakfast and pancakes for dinner. I'd met a peacock and helped a stray cat. I'd even learned to knit. Even though I didn't agree with everything Aunt Ethel did, such as shoot the bat, I liked her. Gradually I relaxed, and when I closed my eyes, I thought about Mom and Stephen. I hoped they were all right. I hoped everything was going well for them in India. I wasn't angry at them anymore. My close brush with death had erased my resentment about spending the summer here. Baseball isn't quite as important when a gun is pointed at your heart. Florence woke me early, as usual. I fed him, grabbed a muffin for myself, and hurried to the treehouse to be sure Mrs. Stray and her kittens had food and water. The food dish was empty, so I refilled it. I didn't see the cats or Willie, and I couldn't wait because Muriel Morris and I were going to the police station in Diamond Hill. We had to give our official accounts of what had happened and sign affidavits. We need to leave early enough for me to stop at home and change clothes, she said. On our way to town, she said, "That was the best night's sleep I've had in years. It was so quiet. I never woke up once." I waited in the car while she went into her apartment to change. She came out wearing a different purple dress and a different red hat. This one had a broad brim with a big purple bow. "You're the talk of the town," she told me. My phone rang 3 times while I was trying to get ready. The whole county is in shock over Aaron Turlip getting caught with a gun and stolen money. She switched on the car radio. A news station was giving details of Mr. Turlip's arrest. It seemed odd to hear the radio announcer broadcast details of something I had actually experienced. When we got to the police station, 2 of the officers who had arrested Mr. Turlip the night before took our statements. I explained again how I happened to find the box. Mrs. Morris told them she couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the word help written in frosting on her daughter's birthday cake. "I almost asked Josh if this was supposed to be a joke," she said, "but then I saw the look in his eyes, and I knew his plea for help was real. Also, I'd seen Ethel's truck parked outside, so I knew the story of her going to Carbon City wasn't true. As soon as I was out of sight of Ethel's house, I tried to use my cell phone to call for help, but I was out of range, so I drove straight to the Carbon City market and used the phone there to call you. I didn't know what was wrong at Ethel's house, but I knew Josh needed help in a hurry. I'd seen a car I didn't recognize parked in Ethel's house, but Josh didn't answer when I asked who it belonged to. Josh, if you hadn't been able to stall the thief," the officer said, "we might not have made it in time. You used your head and did everything you could to keep Mr. Turlip there for as long as possible." I didn't want to give him the money. He said it was his, but I didn't believe him. "You only gave it up when you had to, in order to save your own life. That was the smart thing to do. It's lucky we caught Turlip with the ski mask, the gun, and the money in his car," the other officer said. "If we hadn't, he would never have been a suspect. Friday was his last day at the bank. He had told everyone he was retiring and moving to Florida. He would have gone as planned. We had no reason to think he had stolen cash with him." Mrs. Morris said, "I've known Aaron Turlip for 30 years, and I would never have suspected him." It's sad to see someone who's respected in the community throw away the rest of his life? If he needed money in his retirement, he could have worked part-time in Florida. He could have been a guide on a fishing boat or done something else he enjoyed. Instead, he stole what didn't belong to him. The officer said, "The only fish Mr. Turlip will see in retirement are the ones served for dinner on Fridays in the state prison." "Do you think the money is from the cash for critters auction?" I asked. "It is," the officer said. "We examined it last night." "How can you be sure?" Mrs. Morris asked. "Even though the total amount is the same, how can you prove where it came from unless you know the serial numbers of some of the stolen money?" The police officer smiled. "We can prove it," he said, "thanks to my grandchildren." "Your grandchildren?" I said. "How do they figure into this?" Back when we had the auction, Lexi and Krista earned money to help the animals. They were 8 and 10 years old then. They did chores for my wife and me and for their other grandparents. They even had a Cash for Critters lemonade stand. When it came time to turn in their earnings, I told them I'd match what they had raised. Since they each had earned almost $50, I took their money and gave both of them a $100 bill to take to the auction. "They could still be any $100 bill," Mrs. Morris said. Let me finish the story. Before we left home to go to the auction, Lexi and Krista took a red pencil and printed "for the animals" on their money. When the money was stolen, I alerted every bank in the state to watch for those words on a $100 bill. The two bills never surfaced until last night. They were both in the box Josh found. "For the animals," I said, thinking of Mrs. Stray and her kittens. "All that money is for the animals." "We'll finally get our animal shelter," Mrs. Morris said. "There's one thing I can't figure out," the officer said. "After we arrested him last night, Mr. Turlip kept mentioning a ghost. I've never heard stories of the old Hodge place being haunted." "Before I gave Mr. Turlip the money," I said, "I told him there was a ghost in the room. I was trying to scare him so he would leave. As much as I liked Muriel Morris and the police officers, I didn't want to tell them the truth about Willie. He was my special secret friend, and I wanted to keep it that way." "Mr. Turlip was superstitious," Mrs. Morris said. "I worked at the bank for a short time years ago, and I used to joke about it with the other employees. Mr. Turlip wouldn't step on a sidewalk crack or walk under a ladder, and he disliked Friday the 13th. Telling him you saw a ghost was probably the best thing you could have done to make him nervous." The officer walked with us to the door. A reporter and a cameraman waited outside. "Is this the boy who found the money?" the reporter asked. The police officer told me, "You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to." "I don't mind." The reporter stepped closer and the camera turned toward me. Too bad Aunt Ethel didn't have a TV set so I could watch myself later. When we were finished talking to the news crew, Mrs. Morris drove me to the hospital to visit Aunt Ethel. "Will you come in with me?" I asked. "I have to be accompanied by an adult because I'm not 16 yet." "Of course I'm going in. I can't wait to tell Ethel about all the excitement." As we walked down the hospital corridor, Mrs. Morris said, "I have a grandson your age. Maybe you'd like to go with me to one of Bruce's baseball games. I watch all of them." "Sure," I said. "I was supposed to be on a baseball team myself this summer back in Minneapolis." Before we reached Aunt Ethel's room, we heard her shouting, "Fleas and mosquitoes! This isn't what I asked for." "Uh-oh," Mrs. Morris said. "Sounds as if Ethel is back to normal." When we reached the doorway, we saw a nurse, hands on hips, standing beside Aunt Ethel's bed. "This is a hospital, not a restaurant," the nurse said. "I can't request breakfast items that are not on the menu." "How can you expect the patients to get well if you don't feed us our vegetables?" Aunt Ethel demanded. "For breakfast?" the nurse said. Mrs. Morris entered the room. "Never mind, dear. I brought you some baby carrots from my garden and some lovely ripe strawberries from the fruit stand." "That's better," Aunt Ethel said. She wanted me to eat oatmeal at this time of day. The nurse walked to the door, shaking her head. She was demanding mashed potatoes and spinach, she said, for breakfast. "I hope you're here to take me home," Aunt Ethel said. "Will the doctor let you go?" Mrs. Morris asked. He will as long as someone stays with me. Josh, you're now the official nurse. All you have to do is make sure I keep my foot elevated for a few days. No problem. You couldn't be in more capable hands, Mrs. Morris said. Have you heard the news? What news? You didn't see the television reports? You know I don't watch television. What happened? You really should watch the news, Muriel said. If you did, you'd know what happened at your place last night. Josh is a hero. She began a detailed account of Mr. Turlip's actions and mine. Aunt Ethel kept shaking her head in disbelief. I leave you alone for one night, she said, and all this happens? The police are sure it's the money for the animal shelter, Mrs. Morris said. They recovered all of it, $130,000. Aunt Ethel clapped her hands. As soon as I can, Josh, I'll bake you a thank you from the animal's cake. Chocolate, please, I said. It took another 2 hours to get a prescription from the hospital pharmacy and written instructions for Aunt Ethel's care. Aunt Ethel fidgeted and complained the whole time. Finally, she told the nurse, if you don't release me in the next 10 minutes, I'm leaving anyway. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. We have one more chapter to go. Okay, and there's some things that happen in this next chapter that you will want to hear. Okay, so everything turned out great. Wasn't that good? Okay, so we have one more chapter. Tune in tomorrow, and you'll hear the rest of the story.